who's heard of a SAFT? I'm sure, come on, don't be shy. Everyone has, pretty much. It's simple agreement for future tokens. And who's heard of the Howey test or the Howey case? Now, just take a moment and think how bizarre that is. I'll talk about it. That's a US Supreme Court case from 1946, and we're in Bucharest in 2017 talking about a case from the US from ages ago. It's bizarre. I never thought that was going to happen when I was in law school. So I'm just going to dive right into it. Okay, disclaimer, I'm a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer. That's all you need to know. But I'm friendly. Don't panic. I won't lie to you. Oops, let's go back. Okay, I gave this presentation in Gibraltar at the last d10e and got a tidal wave of responses, and I was wondering whether to do a new subject for this one, but the SEC did me a favor, which is they came out on December 11th, as in just a few days ago, with a agreed upon cease and desist order with this company called Munchie. Who's heard of this, Munchie? This just came out, yeah. And everyone on Facebook and LinkedIn is trying to put forth their opinions about what it means, and no one actually read the order or the background documents. It just made everything far more relevant. So when I gave this presentation before, I was using sort of a hypothetical company. I'm going to use Munchie, mainly because I like their name, but the main idea is don't be a Munchie. All right, let's take one big step back. When you're conducting an ICO in the current environment, obviously people are beginning to pay attention. The SEC is beginning to pay attention, the regulators are paying attention, investors are looking much more closely. It's an increasingly complex world. And with China still mostly offline, or let's say it's offline in terms of doing new ICOs, you realistically, to reach your fundraising goals, need to sell into the United States, which means you have to deal with US securities laws. Okay, but everyone's afraid of that for obvious reasons. When people conduct ICOs or start to conduct ICOs, they don't really know if the tokens they're issuing are securities, and if they are securities, what do you need to do? And we've all heard of the SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission. That's the independent agency in the United States that has what's called delegated authority from the US Congress to make and enforce securities law in the US. And the SEC has a reputation, which is a little bit undeserved, of being harsh or being overly strict. They're being surprisingly calm and normal with these ICO tokens, and I'll kind of go into why a little bit, but you can't ignore them, and you can't try to do an end run around them, because at this point they know what's going on and they'll bust you, basically. Let's see here. All right, let's keep going. All right, so here's a very top-level approach that's going to inform the rest of this presentation. Suppose you have a great startup or not so great startup, Munchie, and you need funding to get up and running. And because you're in 2017 or 2018, you're going to bypass all those annoying VCs, and you're going to issue tokens in order to raise funds. Now, issuing is a loaded term. Issuing is what happens when the startup or some company, for the first time, issues tokens or securities to the initial buyers. It doesn't relate to aftermarket trading or trading on exchanges. When you issue tokens or when you issue securities, it's from the entity that's running the business to the first buyer. So a lot of startups issue tokens to the initial buyers. Okay, now the next question in the analysis, and again, this is big picture that I'm going to dive into a little bit, is are those tokens then being sold into the United States? It's really sold or offered for sale. Okay, either one can trigger US securities law. So if you're in, I'll just pick a random country, don't take it personally. If you're in Azerbaijan, okay, and you're selling from, over the internet, and grandma in Missouri in the United States sees your offer, you're just offering for sale into the United States, and US securities law kicks in. Now you can do all kinds of things. You can block US IP addresses, you can have people sign in blood that they're not a US resident, yada, yada, yada. That's an approach. The problem with that is you can get a smaller ICO result, and you're also not going to have US customers for your product. So there's a strong set of reasons to try to sell into the US if you can. Okay, do you need funding? Are you going to do an ICO to raise funds? Are you going to sell in the US? The next question is, are these tokens that you're selling securities? Do they qualify as securities under US law? And that is the Howey test that I'll go into in a moment. just assume for a moment that the tokens you're selling are securities. Okay, well, the default rule in the United States is if you're offering for sale or selling securities into the United States, you either need to register those securities with the SEC, or you need to find what's called an exemption to registration. That's the famous Reg D or Reg A. And who's heard of Reg D and Reg A? You know, it's amazing. It's, every single time I speak, just a new mass of people know what's going on. It's kind of neat. Okay, if it's not a security, then you don't need to register and you don't need an exemption. But in the US and in most of the world, when you sell stock, you don't need to pay tax on the money you raise from selling that stock. If IBM sells 1 million shares of stock, it doesn't pay tax on the money it just raised by selling that stock. Well, if it sells $1 million worth of computers, it has to pay tax on that million less whatever it costs to make those computers. So here's a little gotcha. If you're selling tokens and they're not securities, then you're really selling goods or services or something else, and you're probably selling it for a profit, in which case you probably owe tax. So just watch it. That's where the canvas kicks in. Okay, the fundamental set of laws that make U.S. securities law come to life, there's really 3 of them. I'm going to focus on one of those 3. The core law, which actually was put in place after the Great Depression, was the Securities Act of 1933. It's also known as the 33 Act. That is the law. Okay, and that rule I described, where if you sell or offer for sale securities into the United States, you have to either register those securities with the SEC or find an exemption. That's in the 33 Act. That's where that comes from. Okay, and like I mentioned, if you're selling over the internet, you're basically selling into the United States. Okay, registering your sale securities with SEC is very expensive. It takes a long time. You really don't want to do it. You want to find an exemption if you can. So again, default rule is you register, but you want to be able to find an exemption. Okay. Okay, forget this wall of text. Here's what this deals with. The Congress knew back when they made the 33 Act that, they wrote in the 33 Act, if it's a stock, it's regulated. If it's a bond, it's regulated. If it's an indenture, it's regulated. But they knew that going out into the future, people were going to come up with whole new things with funky names and weren't conveniently labeled stock, bond, whatever, but nonetheless qualified as a security, because people are tricky. So, they didn't know back in 1933 that someone was going to come up with this idea called a token. What the heck is a token? So they came up with this sort of bucket category, this catch-all category called an investment contract. So the 33 Act, 34 Act, the 40 Act, all those things, they regulate securities, stock, bonds, yada, 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 and also investment contracts. Okay? Not everything is an investment contract. When you go to Starbucks and order a double latte and you wait a minute to get it, even after you paid, it's not an investment contract, even if the value of your latte goes up in those 5 minutes. Not everything is an investment contract. Well, what is an investment contract? What kind of thing that's not under a convenient label like a stock is nonetheless an investment contract and therefore falls underneath the Act and needs to be registered or exempted? That's where the Howey test comes in. And I'm blasting kind of fast here just so I can get to the SAFT fun. Okay, so imagine you're in the far, far future in this strange year 2017. And all of a sudden people are not issuing stocks and bonds anymore, they're issuing tokens. And the 33 Act didn't mention tokens, but they mentioned investment contracts. And some agency, the SEC, is saying, wait a second, we don't care what you call these things. We assert that these things are investment contracts, and therefore you need to either register it or find an exemption. And the SEC, they had their protein shake that morning, is getting aggressive and trying to call everything an investment contract. Well, where's the line? How do you know whether something's an investment contract or not? The US Supreme Court, in the Howey case, came up with the 4-prong test, and each one of these needs to be true for something to qualify as an investment contract and therefore be a security. There needs to be an investment of money, and, remember, each one of these has to be true, in some kind of common enterprise, right? So it's not just some guy or gal out there doing something, with a reasonable expectation of profit, and here's the kicker, to be derived from the entrepreneurial or managerial efforts of others. Right? So if you're the one out there doing it, making money for yourself, that's not a security. It has to be through the efforts of others. Okay, let's go here. Okay, now, suppose you issue a token to use an example from the last talk, that represents an asset. Okay, and that asset produces an income stream. Say it pays a dividend. Well, that's pretty clear. It's a security. You can call it a token. In real life, it's a security. It's some kind of corporate interest, some kind of corporate economic interest that's producing a benefit, and the clock is ticking down. Well, that's clearly a security. You need to register it or find an exemption. Okay, and I just keep blasting here. Now, and if something fails any prong of the Howey test, for example, is not a common enterprise, or there's no expectation of profit, or there's not an investment of money, any one of those, then the default rules, it's not a security, you don't need to register it. Now, here's where life got interesting. This is the law firm, the Cooley law firm's position. And this is where Munchie fell afoul. What Cooley says, and the world and the SEC seems to agree with him now, is that suppose you're an ICO and you're issuing a token, and that token does not qualify as a security underneath the Howey test. Well, theoretically, you shouldn't have to register it with the SEC, nor should you have to find an exemption. Here's a Munchie messed up, and here's where a lot of companies are messing up. If you're trying to raise money in order to build a platform or a product, and you take money from buyers or investors, and you use that money to build the platform, and when the people initially invest, you're giving them tokens, for the time period between when the tokens are issued and those tokens actually becoming functional, they're a security, even if they stop being a security later. So just to use an example, if you want to build a video arcade and you 1 year before it opened, said basically, send me all your Bitcoin, send me all your Ethereum, I'm gonna give you some tokens, and these tokens will work in the video games in my video arcade, and I'm gonna sell them to you for 1% of what they'll normally cost. And then a year later, you take all those funds, you build the video arcade, and the people can take those tokens and sell them for full price in the market. Well, it's true. When they play the video games, it's not a security, they're just playing the video games. But for the period between when you took the investor money and the tokens became functional, there's securities. So what Cooley said is don't issue tokens before your platform is built. Instead, create this thing called a SAFT, a simple agreement for future tokens. Limit your investors so that they're qualified or accredited. Have them give you money. Have this piece of paperwork called a SAFT. Promise them delivery of the tokens in the future once the network is functional. And then, once the network is functional, you can convert those SAFTs into tokens. Those tokens are utilities, they're not securities, and you're safe. What Munchie did and how they got busted, okay, it's so funny. I read their white paper, which they took offline. They took everything offline, but I found it. I read their white paper. They said, we've analyzed our token. It's not a security. We're safe. You know what? They may have been right, but they were raising money for a system that hadn't been built yet. They were raising money in order to build a system. So even if the token would have eventually not been a security, during that initial period, it would have been a security. So the SEC, God bless them, actually called them up and said, you're about to violate the law. Okay, if you do this, you're committing securities fraud. Stop your sale, okay, and sign this order. And Munchie, in their wisdom, stopped. They pulled the sale. If you go to the Munchie ICO website, it's down. There's no DNS record now. White paper's offline. The one-pager, which I was able to find, has the attorney's picture on there. That's offline now, too. Poor lady. Poor lady. Thereby for the grace of God, go all of us. But, and just like with the DAO, actually, the SEC did not press charges. They didn't bring a criminal case, but they're watching. And what the SEC just did with Munchie is they validated the SAFT concept. They validated the idea that before a network is functional, before the platform is functional, you must not issue tokens to the general public in order to raise funds to build it. You can only issue SAFTs to what's known as accredited investors under an appropriate exemption. And I am blasting here. A good case of it being done right is Filecoin, which was mentioned during the last talk. All these documents are online. If you look at the Filecoin SAFT, private placement memorandum, tokenomics, they did it right. This is the last slide. I'm just going to wrap this up. So if you want to do this all right, what I suggest is you have your main project website. And then you have another website dedicated to your ICO sale. It should not be your main project site. And that ICO sale website should have 2 subsites, one for the US, one for everyone else. Okay? And if you're going to sell abroad to everyone else, maybe that's okay. You do that through their broad website and you block IPs and all that other good stuff. But for the US-facing site, you direct them to CoinList or SafLaunch or one of these other platforms where they prove that they're accredited, where they go through a certain amount of vetting, and you comply with one of the exemptions to the registration requirement. And that's all I can do in 15 minutes, and I think we're going to end on a high note. So thank you very much.